Jose Arcadio had gone to Pietro Crespi's store the day before. "I'm marrying Rebecca," he told her. Pietro Crespi turned pale. When they were alone, Pietro Crespi said, "She is his sister." "I don't care," replied Jose Arcadio. She against nature," he explained, "and besides, the law forbids it." "She hit me twice in natura," he said. "And I'm here to tell you so you don't bother going to ask Rebecca anything. Now," he told her in a different tone, "if what she likes is family, that's where Amaranta is for her." Father Nicanor revealed in Sunday's sermon that Jose Arcadio and Rebecca were not brothers. Ursula never forgave what she considered an inconceivable lack of respect, and when she returned from church she forbade the newlyweds to set foot in the house again. For her it was as if they had died. So they rented a little house in front of the cemetery and settled in it with no more furniture than Jose Arcadio's hammock. On the wedding night, Rebecca's foot was bitten by a scorpion that had gotten into her slipper. Her tongue went numb, but that didn't stop them from having a scandalous honeymoon. The neighbors were frightened by the screams that woke up the entire neighborhood up to 8 times in one night, and up to 3 times during siestas, and prayed that such a wild passion would not disturb the peace of the dead. Orleano was the only one who cared about them. He bought them some furniture and provided them with money, until Jose Arcadio regained his sense of reality and began to work the no-man's land that adjoined the patio of the house. Amaranta, on the other hand, never managed to get over her resentment against Rebecca, although her life offered her a satisfaction that she had never dreamed of. Pietro Crespi continued to have lunch at home on Tuesdays, overcoming failure with serene dignity. Amaranta attended him with an affectionate diligence. For Pietro Crespi, that woman he always considered and treated like a girl, it was a revelation. Although her type lacked grace, she had a rare sensitivity to appreciate the things of the world, and a secret tenderness. One Tuesday, Pietro Crespi asked her to marry him. She did not interrupt her work. "Of course, Crespi-ella," he said, "but when you get to know each other better. It is never good to rush things." Ursula was confused. Despite the appreciation she had for Pietro Crespi, she could not establish whether her decision was good or bad from a moral point of view. Orleano, who was the man of her house, confused her even more with her enigmatic and final opinion: "These are not times to think about marriages." That opinion that Ursula only understood a few months later was the only sincere one that Orleano could express at that moment, not only with regard to marriage, but to any matter that was not the war. He himself, facing the firing squad, could not have understood very well how the series of subtle but irrevocable coincidences that led him to that point were chained. Remedios's death did not cause him the shock he had feared. It was rather a dull feeling of rage that gradually dissolved into a solitary and passive frustration, similar to the one he experienced in the days when he was resigned to living without a woman. He sank back into work, but kept up the habit of playing dominoes with his mother-in-law. "Get married again, Orlito," his father-in-law would tell him. "I have 6 daughters to choose from." On a certain occasion, on the eve of the elections, Don Apolinar Mascote returned from one of his frequent trips, worried about the political situation in the country. The liberals were determined to go to war. His mother-in-law gave him schematic lessons. Liberals, he told her, were Masons, bad-natured people, in favor of hanging priests, of introducing civil marriage and divorce, of recognizing equal rights to natural children and legitimate children, and of tearing the country apart in a federal system that would strip authority of power supreme. The conservatives, on the other hand, who had received power directly from God, advocated the stability of public order and family morality. They were the defenders of the faith of Christ, of the principle of authority, and they were not willing to allow the country to be dismembered into autonomous entities. Out of humanitarian sentiments, Orleano sympathized with the liberal attitude regarding the rights of natural children, but in any case he did not understand how one could go to the extreme of waging a war over things that could not be touched with one's hands. It seemed to him an exaggeration that his mother-in-law had sent for the election 6 soldiers armed with rifles, commanded by a sergeant, in a town without political passions. Not only did they arrive, but they went from house to house seizing hunting weapons, machetes, and even kitchen knives. Before handing out to men over 21 the blue ballots with the names of the conservative candidates, and the red ballots with the names of the liberal candidates. On the eve of the elections, Don Apolinar Mascote himself read a proclamation that prohibited from midnight on Saturday, and for 48 hours, the sale of alcoholic beverages and the meeting of more than 3 people who were not from the same family. The elections passed without incident. From 8 o'clock on Sunday morning, the wooden urn guarded by the 6 soldiers was installed in the square. Voted freely. There were almost as many red ballots as blue ones, but the sergeant only left 10 red ones and made up the difference with blue ones. "The liberals will go to war," Orleano said. Don Apolinar did not neglect his dominoes. "If you say it because of the ballot changes, they won't go," he said. "Some red ones are left so there are no claims." Orleano understood the disadvantages of the opposition. "If I were a liberal," he said, I would go to war over this ballot thing. His mother-in-law looked at him over the top of her glasses. Oh, Orlito, he said, if you were a liberal, even if you were my son-in-law, you wouldn't have seen the ballot change. What really caused outrage in the village was not the result of the elections, but the fact that the soldiers had not returned their weapons. They asked him if he was liberal or conservative. Orleano didn't hesitate. If you have to be something, it would be liberal, he said, because conservatives are cheats. The next day, at the request of his friends, he went to visit Dr. Illyrio Noguera to be treated for alleged liver pain. He didn't even know what the meaning of the hoax was. Dr. Illyrio Noguera was actually a fraud. Behind his innocent facade of a doctor without prestige, a terrorist was hiding. Embittered by failure, anxious for a safe place to await old age, the false homeopath took refuge in Macondo. The proximity of the elections was the thread that allowed him to find again the skein of subversion. He established contact with the young people of the town, who lacked political training, and engaged in a stealthy campaign of incitement. The many red ballots that appeared in the ballot box, and which were attributed by Don Apolinar Mascote to the novelism of youth, were part of his plan. He forced his disciples to vote to convince them that the elections were a farce. The only effective thing, he said, is violence. Most of Orleano's friends were enthusiastic about the idea of liquidating the conservative order, but no one had dared to include him in the plans, not only because of his ties to the corregidor, but also because of his solitary and evasive character. It was also known that he had voted blue at the suggestion of his father-in-law. So it was a mere chance that revealed his political feelings, and it was a pure stroke of curiosity that got him into the frenzy of visiting the doctor to treat a pain that he did not have. Then Dr. Noguera closed the window on the pretext that it was too sunny, and explained in simple terms why it was a patriotic duty to assassinate the conservatives. For several days Orleano carried a small vial in his shirt pocket. He would take it out every 2 hours, put 3 little globules in the palm of his hand and squirt them into his mouth to dissolve slowly on his tongue. Don Apolinar Mascote mocked his faith in homeopathy, but those who were in on the plot recognized him as one more of their own. However, the day the doctor revealed the secret to Orleano, the latter exposed the body to the conspiracy. Although he was convinced at the time of the urgency of liquidating the conservative regime, the plan horrified him. His system was reduced to coordinating a series of individual actions that in a master coup of national scope would liquidate the officials of the regime with their respective families, especially children, to exterminate conservatism in the seed. Don Apolinar Mascote, his wife, and his 6 daughters, of course, were on the list. You're not a liberal, nor are you anything, Orleano told him without getting upset. You are nothing but a butcher. Only 6 months later did Orleano learn that the doctor had evicted him as a man of action. They tried to surround him fearing that he would denounce the conspiracy. Orleano reassured them, he wouldn't say a word, but the night they went to assassinate the Mascote family they would find him defending the door. He proved such a convincing decision that the plan was deferred for an indefinite date. It was around those days that Ursula asked his opinion about the marriage of Pietro Crespi and Amaranta, and he replied that the times were not right for thinking about that. For a week he had been wearing an archaic pistol under his shirt. He kept an eye on his friends. In the afternoons he went to have coffee with Jose Arcadio and Rebecca, who were beginning to tidy up his house, and from 7 o'clock he played dominoes with his father-in-law. At school, where Arcadio had older students mixed with children who were barely beginning to speak, the liberal fever had caught on. There was talk of shooting Father Nicanor, of turning the temple into a school, of implanting free love. Orleano tried to temper his impetus. He recommended discretion and prudence. Deaf to his serene reasoning, to his sense of reality, Arcadio reproached him in public for his weakness of character. Finally, at the beginning of December, Ursula burst into the workshop upset. War broke out. Indeed, it had broken out for 3 months. Martial law prevailed throughout the country. While the army platoon that was to occupy the town by surprise arrived. They entered noiselessly before dawn, with 2 mule-drawn light artillery pieces, and set up headquarters in the school. A curfew was imposed at 6 in the evening. A more drastic search than the previous one was carried out, house by house, and this time even the farming tools were taken. They dragged Dr. Noguera out, tied him to a tree in the plaza, and shot him without a trial. Father Nicanor tried to impress the military authorities with the miracle of levitation, and a soldier dismembered him with a rifle butt. Liberal exultation faded into silent terror. Orleano, pale, hermetic, continued playing dominoes with his mother-in-law. He understood that despite his current title of civil and military chief of the plaza, Don Apolinar Mascote was once again a decorative authority. The decisions were made by an army captain who collected an extraordinary manlaiva every morning for the defense of public order. 4 soldiers under his command snatched a woman who had been bitten by a rabid dog from her family and killed her with their butts in the middle of the street. One Sunday, 2 weeks after the occupation, Orleano entered the house of Gerinaldo Márquez. Get the boys ready, he said. We're going to war. Garinaldo Márquez did not believe it. With what weapons? He asked. With theirs, Orleano replied. On Tuesday at midnight, in a crazy operation, 21 men under the age of 30 under the command of Orleano Buendia, armed with table knives and sharp irons, took the garrison by surprise, seized their weapons and shot the captain and the 4 soldiers who had murdered the woman. That same night, while the discharges of the firing squad were heard, Arcadio was named civil and military chief of the plaza. The married rebels barely had time to say goodbye to their wives, whom they left to their own devices. They left at dawn, acclaimed by the population liberated from terror, to join the forces of Revolutionary General Victorio Medina. Before leaving, Orleano took Don Apolinar Mascote out of a closet. "You stay calm, father-in-law," he told him. "The new government guarantees, under word of honor, your personal safety and that of your family." Colonel Orleano Buendia promoted 32 armed uprisings and lost them all. He had 17 sons by 17 different women, who were exterminated one after another in a single night, before the eldest was 35 years old. He escaped 14 bombings, 73 ambushes, and a firing squad. He survived a load of strychnine in his coffee that would have been enough to kill a horse. He rejected the Order of Merit that was awarded to him by the President of the Republic. He became Commander-in-Chief of the Revolutionary Forces, with jurisdiction and command from one border to the other, and the man most feared by the government, but he never allowed his photograph to be taken. He declined the life pension that was offered to him after the war and lived until old age on the little gold fishes that he made in his workshop in Macondo. Although he always fought at the head of his men, the only wound he received from him was caused by himself after signing the capitulation of Neerlandia that put an end to almost 20 years of civil wars. He fired a pistol shot at himself in the chest and the projectile came out of his back without damaging any vital center. The only thing that remained of all that was a street with his name in Macondo. However, according to what he declared a few years before he died of old age, he did not even expect that the morning he left with his 21 men to join the forces of General Victorio Medina. "That's where we'll leave Macondo," was all he said to Arcadio before leaving. "We leave it to you, well, try to find it better." Arcadio gave a very personal interpretation to the recommendation. He invented a uniform with marshal's braid and epaulets, inspired by the illustrations in a book of Melchiades, and hung the sword with golden tassels of the executed captain on his belt. He placed the 2 artillery pieces at the entrance of the town, uniformed his former students. He let them roam the streets armed to give outsiders an impression of invulnerability. It was a double-edged trick, because the government did not dare to attack the square for 10 months, but when it did, it unleashed such a disproportionate force on it that it liquidated the resistance in half an hour. At first no one took him seriously. But one night, when Arcadio entered Caterino's store, the band's trumpeter greeted him with a fanfare that caused laughter from the clientele, and Arcadio had him shot for disrespecting authority. He put those who protested on bread and water with their ankles in a trap that he installed in a room at the school. "You're a murderer." Ursula would yell at him every time she found out about some new arbitrariness. "When Orleano finds out, he's going to shoot you and I'll be the first to rejoice." But it was all useless. Arcadio continued tightening the turnstiles with unnecessary rigor, until he became the cruelest ruler Macondo had ever seen. "Now suffer the difference," Don Apolinar Mascote said on one occasion. "This is the liberal paradise." Arcadio knew it. Leading a patrol he stormed the house, smashed the furniture, beat the daughters, and dragged Don Apolinar Mascote away. When Ursula burst into the courtyard of the barracks, Arcadio himself was preparing to give the order to fire to the firing squad. "Dare you, bastard!" Ursula yelled. Before Arcadio had time to react, he unloaded the first shot at him. "Dare, murderer," he shouted. "And kill me too, son of a bad mother. That way I won't have eyes to cry the shame of having raised a phenomenon." Whipping him mercilessly, he chased him to the end of the patio, where Arcadio coiled up like a snail. Don Apolinar Mascote was unconscious. The boys in the platoon dispersed, fearful that Ursula would end up taking it out on them. He left Arcadio with his uniform dragged, bellowing with pain and rage, and untied Don Apolinar Mascote to take him to his house. From then on it was she who ruled the town. She re-established Sunday Mass, suspended the use of red armbands and disqualified the atrabiliary bands. But despite her strength, she continued to mourn the misfortune of her fate. She felt so alone, that she sought the useless company of her husband forgotten under her chestnut tree. "Look what we're left with," she told him, as the June rains threatened to topple her palm shed. "Look at the empty house, our children scattered around the world, and the 2 of us alone again as in the beginning." José Arcadio Buendia, sunk in an abyss of unconsciousness, was deaf to her cries. She thought she saw, however, that her husband was saddened by her bad news. So, she chose to lie to him. "Don't believe what I tell you," she said, as she sprinkled ashes on her droppings to scoop them up. God wanted Jose Arcadio and Rebecca to get married, and now they are very happy. She became so sincere in her deception that she ended up comforting herself with her own lies. Arcadio is already a serious man, she said, and very brave, and very handsome in his uniform and his sword. But she insisted. She saw him so meek, so indifferent to everything, that she decided to let him go. He didn't even move from the stool. He continued to be exposed to the sun and the rain, as if the ropes were unnecessary, because a domain superior to any visible bond kept him tied to the trunk of the chestnut tree. Around the month of August, Ursula was finally able to give him news that seemed true. "Look how good luck keeps harassing us," she told him. "Amaranta and the Italian from the player piano are going to get married." After crossing the ocean in search of her, after having confused it with passion in Rebecca's passionate groping, Pietro Crespi had found love. Happiness brought with it prosperity. Her warehouse then occupied almost a block, and it was a fantasy greenhouse. Bruno Crespi, his younger brother, was in charge of the store, because he couldn't afford to attend music school. The rigor of the mourning for the death of Remedios had been relegated to a secondary place by the mortification of the war, Aureliano's absence, Arcadio's brutality, and the expulsion of Jose Arcadio and Rebecca. Before the imminence of the wedding, Pietro Crespi himself had insinuated that Aureliano Jose, in whom he fostered an almost paternal affection, was considered his eldest son. His time came with the ominous October rains. Pietro Crespi squeezed her hand in his. "I can't stand this waiting anymore," he told her. "We're getting married next month." Amaranta did not tremble at the contact of her icy hands. She withdrew hers, like a slippery little animal, and went back to her work. "Don't be naive, Crespi," he smiled, "not even dead will I marry you." Pietro Crespi lost control of himself. He cried shamelessly, nearly breaking his fingers in despair, but he couldn't break her. "Don't waste your time," was all Amaranta said. "If you really love me so much, don't set foot in this house again." Ursula thought she was going crazy with shame. Pietro Crespi exhausted the resources of the plea. He went to incredible lengths of humiliation. He locked himself up for hours and hours to play the zither. One night he sang. Macondo woke up in a kind of stupor, angelized by a zither that did not deserve to be of this world and a voice such as could not be conceived that there was another on earth with so much love. Pietro Crespi then saw the light in all the windows of the town, except in Amaranta's. On November 2nd, the Day of All the Dead, his brother opened the store and found all the lamps lit and all the musical boxes uncovered and all the clocks stuck in an endless hour, and in the middle of that crazy concert he found Pietro Crespi in the desk in the back room, with razor-cut wrists and both hands in a basin of benzoin. Ursula arranged for him to be watched at home. "So I am going to bury him, against his will, next to Melchiad's tomb." He did it, with the support of the entire town, in magnificent funerals. Amaranta did not leave the bedroom. For a long time she continued to feel Pietro Crespi's lavender breath at sunset, but she had the strength not to succumb to delirium. Ursula abandoned her. He did not even raise his eyes to take pity on her, the afternoon that Amaranta entered the kitchen and put her hand on the embers of the stove, until it hurt so much that she felt no more pain, but the stench of her own charred flesh. She was a donkey cure for remorse. For several days she walked around the house with her hand in a bowl of egg whites, and when the burns healed it seemed as if the egg whites had also healed the ulcers on her heart. The only external trace left by the tragedy was the black gauze bandage that she put on her burned hand, and that she had to wear until death. Arcadio gave a rare display of generosity by proclaiming the official mourning for the death of Pietro Crespi by means of a proclamation. Ursula interpreted it as the return of the lost lamb. But he was wrong. She had lost Arcadio, not since he wore the military uniform, but forever. Aureliano taught him to read and write, thinking about something else, as a stranger would have done. He gave her clothes, so that visitation could reduce them, when she was already throwing away. Arcadio suffered with his shoes that were too big, with his patched pants, with his woman's buttocks. He never managed to communicate with anyone better than he did with visitation and cator in his language. Melchiades was the only one who really took care of him, who made him listen to his incomprehensible texts and gave him instructions on the art of daguerreotype. No one imagined how much she secretly wept over his death, and how desperately he tried to revive him in the useless study of his papers. The school, where he was paid attention to and respected, and then power, with its strict factions and his uniform of glory, freed him from the weight of an old bitterness. One night, in Caterino's store, someone dared to tell him, "You don't deserve the last name you have." Contrary to what everyone expected, Arcadio did not have him shot. "To the best of my honor," he said, "I am not a Buendia." Pilar Ternera, his mother, who had made his blood boil in the daguerreotype room, was for him an obsession as irresistible as it was first for Jose Arcadio and then for Aureliano. Shortly before the war, One noon when she went later than usual to pick up her youngest son from school. She arrived. Arcadio grabbed her wrist and tried to get her into the hammock. I can't, said Pilar Ternera, horrified. You can't imagine how I would like to please you, but God is my witness that I can't. Arcadio grabbed her around the waist with her tremendous hereditary strength, and felt the world disappear at the contact of her skin. Don't play the saint, he said. Finally, everyone knows you're a whore. Pilar overcame the disgust that her miserable fate inspired in her. The children will find out about it, he murmured. It is better that tonight you leave the door unlocked. Arcadio waited for her that night, shivering with fever in the hammock. Suddenly, when the anxiety had broken down into rage, the door opened. A few months later, facing the firing squad, Arcadio had to relieve the lost steps in the classroom, the stumbling against the benches, and finally the density of a body in the darkness of the room and the throbbing of the air pumped by a heart that was not his. He reached out and found another hand with 2 rings on one finger, about to sink in the dark. Then he understood that this was not the woman he expected, because she did not smell of smoke but of flower glitter, and her breasts were swollen and blind with man's nipples, and her sex was stony and round as a walnut, and the chaotic tenderness of the heightened inexperience. She was a virgin and she had the unlikely name of Santa Sofia de la Piedad. Pilar Ternera had paid her 50 pesos, half of her life savings, for her to do what she was doing. But from that day on she curled up like a cat in the warmth of her armpit. She went to school at siesta time, with the consent of her parents, to whom Pilar Ternera had paid the other half of her savings. Around the time that Arcadio was named civil and military chief, they had a daughter. The only relatives who found out were Jose Arcadio and Rebecca, with whom Arcadio then had intimate relations. Jose Arcadio had bowed his neck to the matrimonial yoke. Rebecca's firm character, the voracity of her belly, her tenacious ambition, absorbed the enormous energy of her husband, who from being lazy and a womanizer became an enormous working animal. They had a clean and tidy house. Rebecca opened it wide at dawn. One afternoon, at the beginning of his administration, Arcadio unexpectedly went to visit them. They had not seen him since they left the house, but he was so affectionate and familiar that they invited him to share the stew. Arcadio had received a complaint against Jose Arcadio. It was said that he began by plowing his patio and had continued straight through the adjoining lands, knocking down fences and destroying ranches with his oxen, until he seized by force the best properties in the area. To the peasants that he had not dispossessed, because he was not interested in his land, he imposed a contribution that he collected every Saturday with the bloodhounds and the double-barreled shotgun. He based his right on the fact that the usurped lands had been distributed by Jose Arcadio Buendia at the time of the foundation. It was an unnecessary allegation, because Arcadio had not gone to do justice. He simply offered to create a property registry office so that Jose Arcadio could legalize the titles to the usurped land, on the condition that he delegate the right to collect taxes to the local government. They agreed. Years later, when Colonel Orleano Buendia examined the property titles, he found that all the lands that could be seen from the hill of his patio to the horizon, including the cemetery, were registered in his brother's name, and that in the 11 months of his mandate Arcadio had loaded not only with the money of the contributions, but also with what he charged the people for the right to bury the dead in Jose Arcadio's land. It took Ursula several months to find out what was already in the public domain, because people hid it from her so as not to increase her suffering. Later, when she found out that Arcadio had not only finished the house but had ordered some Viennese furniture, she confirmed her suspicion that he was disposing of public funds. You are the shame of our last name. Only then did Ursula learn that he had a 6-month-old daughter, and that Santa Sofia de la Piedad, with whom he lived without getting married, was pregnant again. The war, which until then had been nothing more than a word to designate a vague and remote circumstance, materialized into a dramatic reality. At the end of February an ashen-looking old woman arrived in Macondo, mounted on a burro loaded with brooms. She went straight to the barracks. The old woman snapped to attention in a military salute before identifying herself. I'm Colonel Gregorio Stevenson. He had bad news. The last pockets of liberal resistance, she said, were being wiped out. Colonel Orleano Buendia, whom he had left fighting in retreat on the sides of Riohacha, entrusted him with the mission of speaking with Arcadio. He had to hand over the plaza without resistance, making it a condition that the life and property of the liberals be respected on their word of honor. You, of course, bring some written paper, he said. As he spoke, she took off her bodice and placed a little goldfish on the table. I think this will be enough. But Arcadio was inflexible. He had the messenger imprisoned, while he verified his identity, and resolved to defend the square to the death. At the end of March, he abruptly resolved himself with a desperate bugle blast, followed by a cannon shot that shattered the temple tower. In reality, Arcadio's will to resist was insane. They were determined to sacrifice their hides for a lost cause. Faced with the imminence of defeat, some women took to the streets armed with sticks and kitchen knives. In that confusion, Arcadio found Amaranta, who was looking for him like a madwoman, in her nightgown, with two of José Arcadio Buendia's old pistols. Arcadio left Amaranta with Ursula and tried to confront two soldiers who unleashed a blind volley from the corner. Arcadio pushed Ursula towards the house and gave himself up. Shortly after, the shooting stopped and the bells began to ring. The resistance had been annihilated in less than half an hour. At dawn, after a summary war council, Arcadio was shot against the cemetery wall. And the last 2 hours of his life, he failed to understand why the fear that had plagued him since childhood had disappeared. He thought about Ursula, that at that time he must be under the chestnut tree having coffee with José Arcadio Buendia. He was thinking about her 8-month-old daughter, who still had no name, and in whom she was going to be born in August. He thought of Santa Sofía de la Piedad. He thought of his people without sentimentality, in a severe reckoning with life, beginning to understand how much he really loved the people he had hated the most. Arcadio found the formalism of death ridiculous. In reality, he did not care about death but about life, and that is why the feeling he experienced when the sentence was pronounced was not a feeling of fear but of longing. He didn't speak until he was asked what his last wish was. "Tell my wife," he replied in a well-pitched voice, "that she name the girl Ursula. And also tell him that if the one to be born is born a boy, to name him José Arcadio, but not after his uncle, but rather after his grandfather." Before they took him to the wall, Father Nicanor tried to help him. "I have nothing to regret," said Arcadio. He experienced in his nose the same icy hardness that had caught his attention in the nostrils of Remedios's corpse. Oh shit. He managed to think, he forgot to say that if he was born a woman they should name him Remedios. Then, accumulated in a rending blow, he felt again all the terror that had tormented him in life. The captain gave the order to fire. Arcadio barely had time to stick out his chest and raise his head, not understanding where the burning liquid that burned his thighs flowed from. "Bastards!" The scream dash. Long live the Liberal Party. In May the war ended. 2 weeks before the government made the official announcement, in a high-sounding proclamation promising ruthless punishment for the promoters of the rebellion, Colonel Orellano Buendia was taken prisoner as he was about to reach the western border disguised as an indigenous sorcerer. Of the 21 men who followed him to the war, 14 died in combat, 6 were wounded, and only one was with him at the moment of final defeat, Colonel Gerinaldo Márquez. Colonel Orellano Buendia had been sentenced to death, and the sentence would be carried out in Macondo, as a lesson to the population. One Monday, at 10:20 in the morning, Ursula and Amaranta ran to the corner, pushing their way through, and then they saw him. Next to him, also shattered and defeated, they carried Colonel Gerinaldo Márquez. They were not sad. They seemed rather disturbed by the crowd shouting all kinds of insults at the troops. "Go home, Mom," he said. "Ask the authorities for permission and come see me in jail." At dusk, Ursula visited Colonel Orellano Buendia in prison. Ursula showed him what she was carrying in the package, a change of clean clothes, the ankle boots that his son wore for the wedding, and the dulce de leche that she had been saving for him since the day she sensed his return. It seemed to Ursula that he was paler than he was when he left, a little taller and more lonely than ever. He was aware of the details of the house, Pietro Crespi's suicide, Arcadio's arbitrariness and execution, José Arcadio Buendia's impassiveness under the chestnut tree. He knew that Amaranta had consecrated his widowhood as a virgin to raising Orellano José, and that he was beginning to show signs of very good judgment and was reading and writing at the same time that he was learning to speak. In this way, the long-awaited visit, for which both had prepared the questions and even anticipated the answers, was once again the usual daily conversation. When the sentinel announced the end of the interview, Orellano took out a roll of sweaty papers from under the mat on the cot. They were his verses. The ones inspired by Remedios, which he had taken with him when he left, and the ones written later, in the random pauses of the war. "Promise me no one will read them," he said. "This very night light the oven with them." Ursula promised and got up to kiss him goodbye. "I brought you a revolver," she murmured. She turned around and left the room. Colonel Orellano Buendia remained standing, thoughtful, until the door closed. From the beginning of adolescence, when he began to be aware of his omens, he thought that death would be announced with a definite, unequivocal, irrevocable signal, but he was only a few hours away from dying, and the signal did not come. But when they sentenced him to death and asked him to express his last wishes, he had no difficulty in identifying the omen that inspired his response. "I ask that the sentence be carried out in Macondo," he said. The president of the court was upset. "Don't be quick, Buendia," he told him. "It's a ploy to buy time. If you don't comply, that's up to you," the colonel said, "but that's my last wish." Since then the omens had abandoned him. The day that Ursula visited him in prison, after much thought, he came to the conclusion that perhaps death would not be announced that time, because it did not depend on chance but on the will of his executioners. Shortly before dawn he heard footsteps in the corridor. They are coming. He did not feel fear or nostalgia, but an intestinal rage at the idea that this artificial death would not allow him to know the end of so many things that he left unfinished. The next day at the same time he was still like then, raging with the pain in his armpits, and exactly the same thing happened. On Thursday he shared the dulce de leche with the sentinels and put on his clean clothes, which were too tight for him, and his patent leather ankle boots. They still hadn't shot him on Friday. In reality, they did not dare to carry out the sentence. The rebellion of the people made the military think that the execution of Colonel Orellano Buendia would have serious political consequences not only in Macondo but in the entire area of the swamp. On Saturday night, while they waited for the answer, Captain Roque Carnicero went with other officers to Caterino's store. Only one woman told him no one knows what it will be like, but everyone is saying that the officer who shoots Colonel Orellano Buendia, and all the soldiers in the platoon, one by one, will be irremediably killed, sooner or later, even if they hide. In the end of the world. On Sunday, the whole town knew that the officers were ready to evade responsibility for the execution on all kinds of pretexts. The official order arrived in the Monday mail. The execution was to be carried out within 24 hours. That night the officers put 7 ballots with their names in a cap, and the inclement fate of Captain Roque Carnicero was indicated with the winning ballot. I was born a son of a bitch and I die a son of a bitch. At 5 in the morning he chose the platoon by lot, lined it up in the courtyard, and woke up the condemned. Rebecca Buendia got up at 3 in the morning since she learned that Orellano would be shot. They won't shoot him here, Jose Arcadio told him. They will shoot him at midnight in the barracks so that no one knows who formed the platoon, and they will bury him right there. Rebecca kept waiting. They are so stupid that they will shoot him here, she said. On Tuesday at 5 in the morning, Jose Arcadio had had his coffee and let the dogs out, when Rebecca closed the window and grabbed the headboard of the bed to keep from falling. There they bring it, she sighed. How beautiful it is. Jose Arcadio looked out the window and saw him, tremulous in the light of dawn, wearing pants that had been his in his youth. You screw yourself up so much, Colonel Orellano Buendia murmured. So much screwing up to be killed by 6 queers without being able to do anything. By the time the platoon targeted him, the rage had materialized into a bitter goo that numbed his tongue and forced him to close his eyes. Then the aluminum glow of dawn disappeared, and he saw himself again, very young, in shorts and a bow around his neck, and he saw his father on a fine afternoon leading him into the tent, and he saw the ice. When he heard the scream, he opened his eyes with a chilling curiosity, but only found Captain Roque Carnicero with his arms raised, and Jose Arcadio crossing the street with his terrifying shotgun ready to fire. Don't fire, the captain told Jose Arcadio. You are sent by divine providence. There another war began. Captain Roque Carnicero and his 6 men went with Colonel Orellano Buendia to free the revolutionary General Victorio Medina, sentenced to death in Riohacha. So they had to make the dangerous foothill route, with no ammunition other than that of the firing squad. They camped near the villages, and one of them, with a little goldfish in his hand, would enter in disguise in broad daylight and make contact with the liberals at rest, who would go hunting the next morning and never return. When they sighted Riohacha from a bend in the mountains, General Victorio Medina had been shot. Colonel Orellano Buendia's men proclaimed him chief of the revolutionary forces of the Caribbean coast, with the rank of general. After 3 months they had managed to arm more than 1,000 men, but they were exterminated. The survivors reached the eastern border. A government report, released by telegraph and published in jubilant proclamations throughout the country, announced the death of Colonel Orellano Buendia. But 2 days later, a multiple telegram, which almost overtook the previous one, announced another rebellion in the southern plains. Thus began the legend of the ubiquity of Colonel Orellano Buendia. After 16 defeats, Colonel Orellano Buendia left La Guajira with 2,000 well-armed Indians, and the garrison, caught asleep, abandoned Riohacha. There he established his headquarters, and proclaimed total war against the regime. The first notification he received from the government was the threat to shoot Colonel Gerinaldo Márquez within 48 hours if he did not withdraw with his forces to the eastern border. Colonel Roque Carnicero read it with unpredictable joy. Excellent! He exclaimed. We already have a telegraph in Macondo. His response was final. In 3 months he hoped to establish his headquarters in Macondo. If then he did not find Colonel Gerinaldo Márquez alive, he would shoot without trial all the officers he had prisoner at that moment. 3 months later, when he entered Macondo victorious, the first hug he received on the road to the swamp was that of Colonel Gerinaldo Márquez. The house was full of children. Ursula had picked up Santa Sofia de la Piedad, with her eldest daughter and a pair of twins who were born 5 months after Arcadio's execution. Against the last will of the executed, she baptized the girl with the name of Remedios. He named the twins Jose Arcadio Segundo and Orellano Segundo. Amaranta took care of everyone. When Colonel Orellano Buendia returned, A children's choir welcomed him into the house. Orleano Jose, tall like his grandfather, dressed as a revolutionary officer, gave him military honors. Not all the news was good. A year after the escape of Colonel Orleano Buendia, Jose Arcadio and Rebecca went to live in the house built by Arcadio. Nobody found out about his intervention to prevent the execution. Jose Arcadio continued to enjoy the usurped lands, whose titles were recognized by the conservative government. Every afternoon he was seen returning on horseback, with his mountain dogs and his double-barreled shotgun. One afternoon in September, faced with the threat of a storm, he returned home earlier than usual. He greeted Rebecca in the dining room, tied up the dogs in the patio, hung the rabbits in the kitchen to salt them later, and went to the bedroom to change his clothes. Rebecca later testified that when her husband entered the bedroom she locked herself in the bathroom and did not notice anything. It was a difficult version to believe, but there was no other more plausible, and no one could conceive of a reason for Rebecca to murder the man who had made her happy. That was perhaps the only mystery that was never solved in Macondo. As soon as Jose Arcadio closed the bedroom door, the sound of a pistol shot echoed through the house. A trickle of blood came out from under the door, crossed the living room, went out into the street, turned at a right angle in front of the Buendia house, passed under the closed door, crossed the visiting room close to the walls to stain the tapestries. He continued through the other room, eluded the dining room table in a wide curve, advanced along the corridor of begonias and passed without being seen under Amaranta's chair, which was giving an arithmetic lesson to Orleano Jose, and he went through the barn and appeared in the kitchen where Ursula was preparing to break 36 eggs for bread. The Virgin Mary! Ursula yelled. He followed the trickle of blood in the opposite direction, pushed open the bedroom door and almost choked on the smell of burnt gunpowder, and found Jose Arcadio lying face down on the floor on the leggings he had just taken off, and he saw the original corporal of the trickle of blood that had already stopped flowing from his right ear. They did not find any wounds on his body nor could they locate the weapon. Nor was it possible to remove the penetrating smell of gunpowder from the corpse. He was hermetically sealed in a special coffin 8 feet long and 5 feet wide. Although in the following months they reinforced the tomb with superimposed walls and threw caked ash, sawdust, and quicklime between them, the cemetery continued to smell of gunpowder until many years later. As soon as they removed the body, Rebecca closed the doors of her house and buried herself while she was alive. The last time anyone saw her alive was when she shot and killed a thief who tried to force the door of her house. Except for Argenita, her maid, and her confidant, no one had contact with her since then. The town forgot her. Despite her triumphant return, Colonel Orleano Buendia was not enthusiastic about appearances. Although at that time he had more than 5,000 men under his command and dominated 2 littoral states, he was aware of being cornered against the sea. Sensing the fearsome dawn approaching when he would have to give his men the order to throw themselves into the sea. One night of uncertainty when Pilar Ternero was singing in the patio with the troop, he asked her to read the future in the cards. "Watch your mouth," was all that Pilar Ternero made clear after extending and picking up her cards 3 times. "I don't know what it means, but the signal is very clear, watch your mouth." 2 days later someone gave an orderly a cup of coffee without sugar. He hadn't asked for coffee, but since it was there the colonel drank it. He had enough nux vomica to kill a horse. When they took him to his house he was stiff and bowed and his tongue was split between his teeth. Ursula disputed it to death. After cleansing his stomach with emetics, she wrapped him in warm blankets and fed him egg whites for 2 days, until her ravaged body returned to normal temperature. On the 4th day he was out of danger. One night she asked Colonel Gerinaldo Márquez, "Tell me something, compadre, why are you fighting?" "Why should it be, compadre," answered Colonel Gerinaldo Márquez, "because of the great Liberal Party." "Lucky you who know it," he replied. "For my part, I only now realize that I am fighting for pride." "That's bad," said Colonel Gerinaldo Márquez. Colonel Orleano Buendia was amused by his alarm. "Naturally," he said. "But in any case, that's better than not knowing why you fight." He looked into his eyes, and added smiling, "or to fight like you for something that means nothing to anyone." His pride had prevented him from making contact with the armed groups in the interior of the country, until the party leaders publicly rectified their declaration that he was a bandit. He knew, however, that as soon as he put those scruples aside he would break the vicious circle of war. His convalescence allowed her to reflect. So he got Ursula to give him the rest of the buried inheritance and his considerable savings. He named Colonel Gerinaldo Márquez civil and military chief of Macondo, and went to establish contact with the rebel groups in the interior. His political advisors easily entangled him in theoretical labyrinths. But he managed to impose in Macondo the atmosphere of rural peace that Colonel Orleano Buendia dreamed of so he could die of old age making little goldfish. Although he lived in his parents' house, he had lunch at Ursula's 2 or 3 times a week. He introduced Orleano Jose to the handling of firearms, gave him premature military instruction and for several months took him to live in the barracks. Many years before, when he was almost a child, Gabriel Márquez had declared his love for Amaranta. She was then so deluded with his solitary passion for Pietro Crespi that she laughed at him. On a certain occasion, she sent Amaranta a piece of paper from prison, asking her to embroider a dozen cambric handkerchiefs with her father's initials. Amaranta brought the dozen embroidered handkerchiefs to the prison, along with the money, and they stayed for several hours talking about the past. "When I get out of here I'll marry you." On Saturdays, visiting days for prisoners, he went to the house of Gabriel Márquez's parents and accompanied them to jail. One of those Saturdays, Ursula was surprised to see her in the kitchen. "Marry him," she told him. "You will hardly find another man like him." Amaranta feigned a reaction of disgust. "I don't need to go hunting men," he replied. "I'm taking these biscuits to Gabriel because I'm sorry that sooner or later they're going to shoot him." She said it without thinking, but it was around that time that the government made public the threat to shoot Colonel Gabriel Márquez if the rebel forces did not hand over Riohacha. The visits were suspended. Amaranta shut herself up to cry, overwhelmed by a feeling of guilt similar to the one that tormented her when Remedios died, as if once again her thoughtless words had been responsible for a death. Her mother comforted her. She assured him that Colonel Orleano Buendia would do something to prevent the execution, and promised that she herself would take charge of attracting Gabriel Márquez when the war was over. She fulfilled the promise before the expected term. When Gabriel Márquez returned to the house invested with his new dignity as civil and military chief, she received him like a son. Amaranta, in reality, made an effort to ignite in her heart the forgotten ashes of her youthful passion. But the day Colonel Gabriel Márquez reiterated her desire to marry, she rejected him. "I won't marry anyone," she told him, "but least of all with you. You love Orleano so much that you're going to marry me because you can't marry him." Colonel Gabriel Márquez was a patient man. "I will insist again," he said. "Sooner or later I will convince you." She kept visiting the house. Colonel Orleano Buendia, almost 8 months after he left, wrote to Ursula. A special emissary brought a sealed envelope to the house, inside which was a piece of paper written in the colonel's precious calligraphy, "Take good care of Papa because he is going to die." Ursula was alarmed. "If Orleano says it, Orleano knows it," she said. And she asked for help to take José Arcadio Buendia to her bedroom. The next day she did not wake up in bed. After looking for him in all the rooms, Ursula found him again under the chestnut tree. So they tied him to the bed. But in reality, the only person with whom he could have had contact for a long time was Prudencio Aguilar. Already almost pulverized by the profound decrepitude of death, Prudencio Aguilar went twice a day to talk with him. It was Prudencio Aguilar who cleaned him, fed him, and brought him splendid news about a stranger named Orleano who was a colonel in the war. He dreamed that he got out of bed, opened the door and went into another room just the same, from that room he went to another exactly the same, ad infinitum. He liked to go from room to room, like in a gallery of parallel mirrors, until Prudencio Aguilar touched him on the shoulder. Then he would return from room to room, waking up backwards, going the other way, and found Prudencio Aguilar in the room of reality. But one night, 2 weeks after they put him to bed, Prudencio Aguilar touched him on the shoulder in a middle room, and he stayed there forever, thinking it was the real room. The next morning Ursula was bringing him breakfast when she saw a man approaching along the corridor. He was small and stocky, in a black cloth suit and an enormous black hat, sunken down to his taciturn eyes. "My God," Ursula thought. "I could have sworn it was Melchiades." It was Cator, Visitation's brother, who had left the house fleeing the plague of insomnia, and who was never heard from again. Visitation asked him why he had come back, and he answered in his solemn language, "I have come to the king's funeral." Then they entered José Arcadio Buendia's room, shook him with all their might, shouted in his ear, put a mirror in front of his nostrils, but they couldn't wake him up. A little later, when the carpenter was taking measurements for the coffin, they saw through the window that a drizzle of tiny yellow flowers was falling. They fell all night on the town in a silent storm, covering the roofs. So many flowers fell from the sky that the streets awoke upholstered with a compact quilt, and they had to clear them with shovels and rakes so that the funeral could take place. Sitting in the wicker rocker, Amaranta looked at Orleano José and Amaranta with the impression that at that moment she had begun to age. "You look exactly like Orleano when he was your age," he said. "You are already a man." It had been for a long time, since the distant day when Amaranta thought she was still a child and continued undressing in the bathroom in front of him, as she had always done, as she had gotten used to doing since Pilar Ternera gave it to her for who just raised him. The first time he saw her, the only thing that caught his attention about her was the deep depression between her breasts. Some time later, when she recovered from Pietro Crespi's suicide and went back to bathing with Orleano José, he no longer noticed the depression, but experienced an unknown shudder at the sight of her splendid breasts with purple nipples. From a very young age he had the habit of leaving the hammock to wake up in Amaranta's bed, whose contact had the virtue of dispelling the fear of the dark. But from the day he became aware of his nakedness, it wasn't the fear of the dark that prompted him to get into his mosquito net, but rather the longing to feel Amaranta's warm breath at dawn. One morning, around the time that she rejected Colonel Gerinaldo Márquez, Orleano José woke up feeling short of breath. He felt Amaranta's fingers like little hot and anxious worms looking for her belly. Pretending to sleep, he changed his position to eliminate any difficulty. Although they seemed to ignore what they both knew, and what each one knew the other knew, from that night on they were linked by an inviolable complicity. Then not only did they sleep together, naked, exchanging exhausting caresses, but they chased each other around the corners of the house and locked themselves in the bedrooms at any hour, in a permanent state of elation without relief. He realized that she had gone too far from her, that she was no longer playing kissy with the child, but instead splashing about in a dangerous and hopeless autumnal passion, and he cut her off. Orleano José, who was then finishing his military training, finally admitted reality and went to sleep in the barracks. He consoled himself for her abrupt solitude, for her premature adolescence, with women smelling of dead flowers that he idealized in the dark and turned into Amaranta through anxious efforts of imagination. Shortly after, contradictory reports of the war began to be received. While the government itself admitted the progress of the rebellion, officials in Macondo had confidential reports that a negotiated peace was imminent. In early April, a special emissary identified himself to Colonel Gerinaldo Márquez. He confirmed that, indeed, the party leaders had established contacts with rebel leaders from the interior, and were on the eve of concluding the armistice in exchange for 3 ministries for the liberals. The emissary was carrying a highly confidential order from Colonel Orleano Buendia, who disagreed with the terms of the armistice. Colonel Gerinaldo Márquez was to select 5 of his best men and prepare to leave the country with them. Colonel Orleano Buendia and 10 trusted officers, including Colonel Roque Carnicero, stealthily arrived in Macondo after midnight, dispersed the garrison, buried the weapons, and destroyed the archives. At dawn they had left the town with Colonel Gerinaldo Márquez and his 5 officers. Ursula didn't find out about her until the last minute, when someone tapped on her bedroom window and murmured, "If you want to see Colonel Orleano Buendia, come to the door right now." Only the next day did she find out that Orleano José had left with her father. 10 days after a joint communique from the government and the opposition announced the end of the war, there was news of the first armed uprising by Colonel Orleano Buendia on the western border. His few and poorly armed forces were dispersed in less than a week. But in the course of that year, while liberals and conservatives tried to get the country to believe in reconciliation, he attempted another 7 uprisings. One night he shelled Ryahacha from a schooner, and the garrison dragged from their beds and shot in retaliation the 14 best-known liberals in the town. He occupied a border customs office for more than 15 days, and from there he addressed a call to general war to the nation. On one occasion he was less than 20 kilometers from Macondo, and was forced by government patrols into the mountains very close to the enchanted region where his father had found the fossil of a Spanish galleon many years before. Visitation died around that time. He gave himself the pleasure of dying a natural death, and his last wish was that they dig up from under his bed the salary he had saved over 20 years, and send it to Colonel Orleano Buendia so that he could continue the war. But Ursula did not bother to get that money, because in those days it was rumored that Colonel Orleano Buendia had been killed. It was taken for granted for almost 6 months, since nothing was heard of him again. Suddenly, Colonel Orleano Buendia was alive, but had apparently given up harassing the government of his country, and had joined the triumphant federalism in other Caribbean republics. The first direct news that Ursula received from him, several years after he had left, was a wrinkled and blurred letter that arrived from hand to hand from Santiago de Cuba. "We've lost him forever," Ursula exclaimed as she read it. "Along this path will pass Christmas at the end of the world." The person to whom he told it, who was the first to whom he showed the letter, was the conservative General José Raquel Moncada, mayor of Macondo since the end of the war. Also, like many of his co-supporters, he was anti-militarist. He viewed the people at arms as unprincipled idlers, schemers, and ambitious, adept at taking on civilians to thrive in disorder. He had been at one point the most fearsome adversary of Colonel Orleano Buendia. Since then, even in the most bitter periods of the war, the two commanders arranged truces to exchange prisoners. They were pauses with a certain festive atmosphere that General Moncada took advantage of to teach Colonel Orleano Buendia how to play chess. They became great friends. They even thought about the possibility of coordinating the popular elements of both parties to liquidate the influence of the military and professional politicians, and establish a humanitarian regime that would take advantage of the best of each doctrine. When the war ended, while Colonel Orleano Buendia was slipping through the defile of permanent subversion, General Moncada was named corregidor of Macondo. He got Macondo to be erected into a municipality and was therefore its first mayor, and created an atmosphere of trust that made the war seem like an absurd nightmare from the past. Father Nicanor, consumed by liver fever, was replaced by Father Coronel, whom they called El Cachorro. Bruno Crespi, married to Amparo Mascote, and whose toy and musical instrument store never tired of prospering, built a theater, which the Spanish companies included in their itineraries. It was also around this time that the school building was restored. Don Melchor Escalona took charge of her. Orleano Segundo and José Arcadio Segundo, the willful twins from Santa Sofia de la Piedad, were the first to sit in the classroom. Remedios, heir to her mother's pure beauty, was beginning to be known as Remedios, la Bella. Despite the time, the overlapping mourning and the accumulated afflictions, Ursula resisted growing old. She, helped by Santa Sofia de la Piedad, had given a new impetus to her confectionery industry, and she not only recovered in a few years the fortune that her son had spent in the war. That was how things were when Orleano José deserted from the Federalist troops in Nicaragua, joined the crew of a German ship, and appeared in the kitchen of the house, solid as a horse, dark and hairy as an Indian, and with the secret determination to marry Amaranta. When Amaranta saw him come in, without him having said anything, she immediately knew why he had come back. He was warned against casual encounters. He tried not to separate from Remedios, the beauty. One morning, almost 2 months after her return, he heard him enter the bedroom. Then instead of running away, instead of crying out as he had intended, he allowed himself to be swamped by a soft sense of release. From that night the silent battles resumed without consequences that lasted until dawn. "I'm your aunt," Amaranta murmured, exhausted. "She is almost as if she were your mother, not only because of her age, but because the only thing I lacked was to breastfeed you." Orleano would escape at dawn and return the following morning, more and more excited by the verification that she did not pass the knocker. He had fled from her, trying to annihilate her memory not only with distance, but with a dazed fierceness that his comrades in arms described as reckless, but the more he wallowed his image in the dunghill of war, the more war resembled Amaranta. "You're a brute," Amaranta told him, harassed by her bloodhounds. "It is not true that this can be done to a poor aunt, unless it is with a special dispensation from the Pope." Orleano José promised to go to Rome, only for her to lower her drawbridges. "It's not just that," Amaranta countered. "It is that children are born with a pig's tail." Orleano José was deaf to all arguments. "Even if armadillos are born," he begged. One morning, overcome by the unbearable pain of repressed virility, he went to Catarino's store. He found a woman with flaccid breasts, affectionate and cheap, who appeased his belly for some time. He tried to apply her contempt treatment to Amaranta. Amaranta felt liberated from a ballast. Orleano José could not imagine how much ground he had lost. The night he could no longer resist the farce of indifference, and he returned to Amaranta's room. She pushed him away with unyielding, unequivocal determination, and the bedroom latch was thrown forever. A few months after Orleano José's return, an exuberant woman, scented with jasmine, showed up at the house with a child of about 5 years. She stated that he was the son of Colonel Orleano Buendia and was taking him to Ursula to baptize him. They baptized him with the name of Orleano, and with his mother's surname, because the law did not allow him to bear his father's surname until he recognized it. 9 more children of Colonel Orleano Buendia were brought to the house to be baptized. The eldest, a strange dark-haired man with green eyes who had nothing to do with his father's family, had passed the age of 10. They brought children of all ages, of all colors, but all boys, and all with an air of loneliness that did not allow their kinship to be doubted. In less than 2 years they baptized with the name of Orleano, and with the surname of the mother, all the children that the colonel scattered throughout his war territories, 17. At first Ursula filled their pockets with money and Amaranta tried to keep them. But they ended up limiting themselves to giving them a gift and serving as their godmothers. During lunch, commenting with General Moncada on that disconcerting proliferation, she expressed the wish that Colonel Orleano Buendia would come back one day to reunite all his children in the house. "Don't worry, comadre," General Moncada said enigmatically. "It will come sooner than you think." What General Moncada knew, and did not want to reveal at lunch, was that Colonel Orleano Buendia was already on his way to lead the longest, most radical, and bloodiest rebellion ever attempted. Liberals singled him out as a provocateur. "Something tremendous is going to happen," Ursula told Orleano José. "Don't go out on the street after 6 in the evening." They were useless pleas. Orleano José, like Arcadio in other times, had ceased to belong to him. His passion for Amaranta was extinguished without leaving any scars. He ended up not coming back to the house except to change his clothes. Contrary to Arcadio, who never knew his true origin, he found out that he was the son of Pilar Ternera, who had hung a hammock for him to take a siesta at her house. They were, more than mother and son, accomplices in solitude. Pilar Ternera had lost all hope. But her heart grew old without bitterness. Fat, talkative, with the airs of a matron in disgrace, she renounced the sterile illusion of the deck of cards and found a haven of consolation in the loves of others. In the house where Orleano José slept his siesta, the girls from the neighborhood received their casual lovers. I'm happy knowing that people are happy in bed. He never charged for the service. She never withheld favor from her, as she did not withhold it from the countless men who sought her out even in the twilight of her maturity, providing neither money nor love, and only sometimes pleasure. Her 5 daughters, heirs to a burning seed, have been lost in the twists and turns of life since adolescence. Of the 2 boys she managed to raise, one died fighting in the army of Colonel Orleano Buendia and the other was wounded and captured at the age of 14. In a certain way, Orleano José was the tall, dark man who for half a century announced to him the King of Cups, and who, like all the envoys of the decks, reached his heart when he was already marked by the sign of death. Don't go out tonight, he told her. Stay here to sleep, because Carmelita Montiel is tired of begging me to put her in your room. Orleano José did not understand the deep sense of supplication that offer had. Tell her to wait for me at midnight, he said. He went to the theater where a Spanish company was announcing El Punal del Zorro. Only when handing in the ticket at the door did Orleano José realize that Captain Uccuils Ricardo, with 2 soldiers armed with rifles, was searching the crowd. Be careful, Captain, Orleano José warned him. The man who lays hands on me has not yet been born. The captain tried to search him by force, and Orleano José, who was unarmed, began to run. The soldiers disobeyed the order to fire. He is a Buendia, one of them explained. Blind with fury, the captain then snatched the rifle from him, opened it in the middle of the street, and took aim. Bastards! He managed to yell. I wish it were Colonel Orleano Buendia. Carmelita Montiel, a 20-year-old virgin, had just bathed in orange blossom water and was sprinkling rosemary leaves on Pilar Turner's bed when the shot rang out. Orleano José was destined to experience with her the happiness that Amaranta denied him, to have 7 children and to die of old age in her arms, but the rifle bullet that entered his back and shattered his chest was directed by a misinterpretation of the deck's Captain Uccuils Ricardo, who was actually the one destined to die that night, actually died 4 hours before Orleano José. As soon as the shot rang out, he was knocked down by 2 simultaneous bullets, the origin of which was never established. Long live the Liberal Party. Long live Colonel Orleano Buendia. At 12 o'clock, when Orleano José had finished bleeding to death and Carmelita Montiel found the cards of her future blank, more than 400 men had paraded in front of the theater and had unloaded their revolvers on the abandoned corpse of Captain Uccuils Ricardo. Disgruntled by the impertinence of the regular army, General José Raquel Moncada mobilized his political influence, returned to wearing the uniform and assumed the civil and military leadership of Macondo. While the government announced that it was in control of the entire country, the liberals received secret reports of armed uprisings in the interior. This means that he has returned, Ursula rejoiced before General Moncada. But he himself ignored it? In reality, Colonel Orleano Buendia had been in the country for more than a month. Moncada did not believe in his return until it was officially announced that he had taken over 2 coastal states. I congratulate you, comadre, he said to Ursula, showing her the telegram. Very soon you will have it here. Ursula was worried then for the first time. And what will you do, compadre? He asked. General Moncada had asked himself that question many times. The same as him, comadre, he replied, doing my duty. On the 1st of October, at dawn, Colonel Orleano Buendia attacked Macondo with 1,000 well-armed men and the garrison was ordered to resist until the end. At noon, while General Moncada was having lunch with Ursula, a rebel cannon shot that resounded in the town pulverized the facade of the municipal treasury. At 2 in the afternoon, while the earth trembled with the cannon fire from both sides, he said goodbye to Ursula with the certainty that he was fighting a losing battle. I pray to God that I don't have Orleano in the house tonight, he said. If so, give him a hug from me, because I don't expect to see him ever again. That night he was captured when he tried to escape from Macondo, after writing a long letter to Colonel Orleano Buendia, in which he reminded him of the common goals of humanizing war, and wished him a definitive victory against the corruption of the military and the ambitions of the military. Of politicians from both parties. The next day Colonel Orleano Buendia had lunch with him at Ursula's house, where he was confined until a Revolutionary War Council decided his fate. But Ursula had the grim impression that his son was an intruder. He issued orders of a blunt severity, and did not allow anyone to approach him less than 3 meters, not even Ursula. His head, now receding, looked slow-baked. As soon as the order to bury the dead in the common grave was carried out, he assigned Colonel Roque Carnicero the mission of speeding up the war trials, and he set about the exhausting task of imposing radical reforms that would leave no stone unturned in the collapsed structure of the conservative regime. It was then that he decided to review the land titles, up to 100 years ago, and discovered the legalized outrages of his brother José Arcadio. He voided the records in one fell swoop. In a final gesture of courtesy, he disregarded her business for an hour and visited Rebecca to fill her in on her determination. In the gloom of the house, the lonely widow who had once been the confidant of her repressed loves, and whose obstinacy saved her life, was a spectre from the past. She began by advising him to moderate the rigor of her mourning, to air out the house, to forgive the world the death of José Arcadio. But now Rebecca was safe from all vanity. After futilely searching for it in the taste of the land, in the perfumed letters of Pietro Crespi, in the stormy bed of her husband, she had found peace in that house where her memories materialized by the force of evocation relentless. Rebecca was not even moved by the news that the land usurped by José Arcadio would be returned to its legitimate owners. "What you say will be done, Orleano," she sighed. "I always believed, and I confirm it now, that you are an outcast." The review of property titles was carried out at the same time as the summary trials, presided over by Colonel Gabriel Márquez, and which concluded with the execution of all the officers of the regular army imprisoned by the revolutionaries. At midnight, General José Raquel Moncada was sentenced to death. Colonel Orleano Buendia, despite Ursula's violent recriminations, refused to commute her sentence. Shortly before dawn, he visited the condemned man in the stocks room. "Remember, compadre," he told him, "I'm not going to shoot you. The revolution shoots you." "Go to hell, compadre," he replied. Until that moment, since his return, Colonel Orleano Buendia had not given himself the opportunity to see him with his heart. He was amazed at how much he had aged, at the trembling of his hands, at the somewhat routine compliance with which he awaited death, and then he experienced a deep contempt for himself that he mistook for a principle of mercy. "What worries me," he added, "is that from hating the military so much, from fighting them so much, from thinking about them so much, you have ended up being equal to them. And there is no ideal in life that deserves so much abjection. At this rate," he concluded, "you will not only be the most despotic and bloodthirsty dictator in our history, but you will also shoot my comadre Ursula trying to appease your conscience." General Moncada then handed him the glasses, the medal, the watch, and the ring, and changed his tone. "But I didn't bring you here to scold you," he said. "I wanted to beg you for the favor of sending these things to my wife." "I'll do it with great pleasure, José Raquel," Colonel Orleano Buendia said. When he stepped out into the blue mist air, his face moistened like another sunrise from the past, and only then did she understand why he had arranged for the sentence to be carried out in the courtyard, and not on the cemetery wall. The platoon, formed in front of the door, paid him the honors of head of state. "You can bring it now," he ordered. Colonel Gabriel Márquez was the first to perceive the emptiness of the war. In his capacity as civil and military chief of Macondo, he held telegraphic conversations twice a week with Colonel Orleano Buendia. Little by little, however, and as the war intensified and spread, the image of him was erased in a universe of unreality. The dots and dashes of his voice grew more remote and uncertain, joining and combining to form words that gradually lost all meaning. "Understand, Orleano," he concluded in The Manipulator. "Long live the Liberal Party." He ended up losing all contact with the war. What was once a real activity, an irresistible passion of his youth, became for him a remote reference, a void. His only refuge was Amaranta's sewing box. He visited her every afternoon. They spent many hours without speaking, satisfied with each other's company, but while Amaranta took great pleasure in keeping alive the fire of her devotion, he did not know what the secret designs of that indecipherable heart were. Since then, even in the most critical days of the war, he visited her every afternoon. But for 4 years he reiterated her love, and she always found a way to reject him without hurting him, because even though she couldn't love him, she couldn't live without him. Remedios, the beauty, who seemed indifferent to everything, and who was thought to be mentally retarded, was not insensitive to such devotion, and she intervened on behalf of Colonel Gabriel Márquez. Amaranta suddenly discovered that the girl he had raised, who was just emerging from adolescence, was already the most beautiful creature Macondo had ever seen. He felt reborn in her heart the resentment that he once felt against Rebecca, and begging God not to drag her to the point of wishing her death, he banished her from the sewing room. He appealed to his reserves of persuasion, to his immense and repressed tenderness, ready to give up for Amaranta a glory that had cost him the sacrifice of his best years. But he failed to convince her. Amaranta locked herself in her bedroom to mourn his loneliness to death, after giving the definitive answer to his tenacious suitor. "Let's forget forever," he told her, "we're already too old for these things." However, 2 months later, when Colonel Orleano Buendia returned to Macondo, the bewilderment turned into stupor. He arrived quietly, without an escort, wrapped in a blanket despite the heat, and with 3 lovers that he installed in the same house, where he spent most of his time lying in a hammock. At night, at siesta time, he would call one of her women to the hammock and get a rudimentary satisfaction from her, and then he would sleep a stony sleep undisturbed by the slightest hint of concern. At first, intoxicated by the glory of the return, by the unlikely victories, he had peered into the abyss of greatness. He took pleasure in keeping the Duke of Marlborough, his great teacher in the arts of war, at his fingertips. It was then that he decided that no human being, not even Ursula, should approach him within 3 meters. The first time he was in Manor after the execution of General Moncada, he hastened to fulfill the last wish of his victim, and the widow received the glasses, the medal, the watch, and the ring, but did not allow him to pass the door. Colonel Orellano Buendia did not show any resentment, but his spirit only found peace when his personal guard looted and reduced the widow's house to ashes. "Take care of your heart, Orellano," Colonel Gerinaldo Márquez told him then. "You're rotting alive." Around this time he called a second assembly of the main rebel commanders. He found everything: idealistic, ambitious, adventurous, social, resentful, and even common criminals. Many did not even know why they were fighting. A shadowy authority stood out: General Teofilo Vargas. He was a pure Indian, wild, illiterate, endowed with a taciturn malice and a messianic vocation that aroused in his men an insane fanaticism. Colonel Orellano Buendia promoted the meeting with the purpose of unifying the rebel command against the maneuvers of the politicians. General Teofilo Vargas anticipated his intentions. In a few hours he broke up the coalition of the best qualified commanders and seized the central command. Then a very young captain who had always been noted for his shyness raised a cautious index finger. "It's very simple, Colonel," he proposed. "You have to kill him." "Don't expect me to give that order," he said. He didn't actually give it. But 15 days later General Teofilo Vargas was hacked to pieces in an ambush, and Colonel Orellano Buendia assumed central command. The very night his authority was recognized by all the rebel commandos, he woke up with a start, crying out for a blanket. An internal cold that scratched his bones and mortified him even in full sun prevented him from sleeping well for several months, until it became a habit for him. Seeking a remedy against the cold, he had the young officer who proposed the assassination of General Teofilo Vargas shot. His orders were carried out before they were given, even before he conceived them, and they always went far beyond where he would have dared to send them. Lost in the solitude of his immense power, he began to lose his way. He was convinced that his own officers were lying to him. He fell out with the Duke of Marlborough. "The best friend," he used to say then, "is the one who has just died." He got tired of the uncertainty, the vicious circle of that eternal war that always found him in the same place, only getting older, more finished, more without knowing why or how or for how long. And normality was precisely the most frightening thing about that infinite war, that nothing happened. Alone, abandoned by omens, fleeing from the cold that was to accompany him until death, he sought a last refuge in Macondo, in the warmth of his oldest memories. In early December, the long-awaited interview, which many had anticipated as an endless discussion, was resolved in less than an hour. They asked, first of all, to renounce the review of land titles in order to recover the support of the liberal landowners. They asked, secondly, to give up the fight against clerical influence in order to obtain the support of the Catholic people. They asked, finally, to renounce the aspirations of equal rights between natural and legitimate children to preserve the integrity of homes. "It means," Colonel Orellano Buendia smiled when he finished reading, "that we are only fighting for power. These are tactical reforms." One of the delegates replied, "For now, the essential thing is to broaden the popular base of the war. We'll see later." One of Colonel Orellano Buendia's political advisers hastened to intervene. "It's a contradiction," he said. "If these reforms are good, it means that the conservative regime is good. If with them we will be able to broaden the popular base of the war, as you say, it means that the regime has a broad popular base. He means, in short, that for almost 20 years we have been fighting against the sentiments of the nation. Don't waste time, doctor," he said. "The important thing is that from this moment we only fight for power. Since it is so," he concluded, "we have no objection to accepting." His men looked at each other in dismay. "Forgive me, Colonel," Colonel Gerinaldo Márquez said softly, "but this is a betrayal." Colonel Orellano Buendia stopped the ink pen in the air and unloaded the full weight of his authority on him. "Give me your weapons," he ordered. Colonel Gerinaldo Márquez got up and put his weapons on the table. "Report to the barracks," Colonel Orellano Buendia ordered. "You remain at the disposal of the revolutionary tribunals." Then he signed the declaration and gave the documents to the emissaries, telling them, "Gentlemen, here are your papers. Let them take advantage." 2 days later, Colonel Gerinaldo Márquez, accused of high treason, was sentenced to death. The day before the execution, disobeying the order not to disturb him, Ursula visited him in her bedroom. "I know you will shoot Gerinaldo," she said serenely, "and I can't do anything to prevent it. But one thing I'll warn you, as soon as I see the body, I swear to you by the bones of my father and my mother, by the memory of José Arcadio Buendia, I swear to God, that I will get you out of wherever you are and I will kill you with my own hands." Orellano Buendia scratched for many hours, trying to break the hard shell of his loneliness. His only happy moments, since the remote afternoon when his father took him to see ice, had been spent in the silver workshop, where he spent time putting together little gold fishes. He had had to promote 32 wars, and he had had to violate all his pacts with death and wallow like a pig in the dunghill of glory, to discover almost 40 years late the privileges of simplicity. At dawn, ravaged by the stormy vigil, he appeared in the stocks room an hour before the execution. "The farce is over, compadre," he told Colonel Gabriel Márquez. "Let's get out of here, before the mosquitoes finish shooting you." Colonel Gabriel Márquez could not repress the contempt that this attitude inspired in him. "No, Orleano," he replied. "It is better to be dead than to see you turned into a cutlass." "You won't see me," Colonel Orleano Buendia said. "Put on your shoes and help me end this fucking war." It took almost a year of bloody rigor for him to force the government to propose peace terms favorable to the rebels, and another year to persuade his supporters to accept them. He went to inconceivable extremes of cruelty to quell the rebellions of his own officers, who refused to give up victory, and ended up relying on enemy forces to finish subduing them. He was never a better warrior than he was then. The certainty that he was finally fighting for his own liberation, and not for abstract ideals, for slogans that politicians could turn right and left depending on the circumstances, filled him with a fiery enthusiasm. In almost 20 years of war, Colonel Orleano Buendia had been to the house many times, but the state of emergency in which he always arrived, the military apparatus that accompanied him everywhere, the aura of legend that gilded his presence and to which not even Ursula herself was insensitive, they ended up turning him into a stranger. But when the proximity of the armistice became known and it was thought that he would return again as a human being, finally rescued for the hearts of his family, the family affections that had been lethargic for so long were reborn stronger than ever. "At last," said Ursula, "we will have a man in the house again." The regular army had to protect the house. He arrived humiliated, spat on, accused of having intensified the war only to sell it more expensively. 6 months before, when he heard about the armistice, Ursula had opened and swept the bridal bedroom, and had burned myrrh in the corners, thinking that he would come back ready to grow old slowly among Remedios's musty dolls. But in reality, in the last 2 years he had paid his final dues to life, including aging. He sat on the porch, wrapped in the blanket and without taking off his boots, as if barely expecting it to clear up, and spent the whole afternoon watching it rain on the begonias. Ursula understood then that he would not have him in the house for a long time. If it isn't war, he thought, it can only be death. It was such a neat guess, so convincing, that he identified it as an omen. That night, at dinner, the alleged Orleano II broke the bread with his right hand and ate the soup with his left. His twin brother, the so-called José Arcadio II, crumbled the bread with his left hand and ate the soup with his right. But Colonel Orleano Buendia did not notice it. He seemed so oblivious to everything that he didn't even notice Remedios, the beauty, who went naked to the bedroom. Ursula was the only one who dared to disturb her abstraction. "If you have to go again," she told him halfway through dinner, "at least try to remember what we were like tonight." Then Colonel Orleano Buendia realized, without surprise, that Ursula was the only human being who had managed to unravel her misery, and for the first time in many years he dared to look at her face. She had cracked skin, rotten teeth, withered and colorless hair, and an astonished look. He compared her to his earliest memory of her, the afternoon he had a foreboding that a pot of boiling broth was going to fall off her table, and he found her in pieces. He then made one last effort to search her heart for the place where her affections had rotted, and he could not find it. Remedios herself, his wife, was at that moment the blurred image of someone who could have been his daughter. The only affection that prevailed against time and war was the one she felt for his brother, José Arcadio, when they were both children, and it was not based on love, but on complicity. "Excuse me," he apologized to Ursula's request. "It is that this war has ended everything." In the days that followed, she took care to destroy all traces of her passage through the world. He simplified the silver workshop until only impersonal objects were left. He gave his clothes to the orderlies and buried his weapons in the patio with the same sense of penitence with which his father buried the spear that killed Prudencio Aguilar. He only kept one pistol, and with only one bullet. Ursula did not intervene. The only time she dissuaded him was when he was about to destroy the daguerreotype of Remedios that was kept in the room, lit by an eternal lamp. "That portrait ceased to belong to you a long time ago," he told her. "It's a family heirloom." On the eve of the armistice, when there was no longer a single object in the house that would allow him to be remembered, he took the trunk with the verses to the bakery just as Santa Sofia de la Piedad was preparing to light the oven. He not only did it, but he smashed the trunk with a hatchet and threw the splinters into the fire. Hours before, Pilar Ternera had been to visit him. She was amazed at how much he had grown old and fat, and how much he had lost the splendor of his laughter, but she was also amazed at the depth he had achieved in reading the cards. "Watch your mouth," she told him, and he wondered if the other time he said it to her, at the height of his glory, it hadn't been a startlingly foreshadowing of his fate. Armistice Tuesday dawned warm and rainy. Colonel Orleano Buendia appeared in the kitchen before 5 o'clock and had his usual coffee without sugar. On a day like this you came into the world, Ursula told him. Everyone was scared with your eyes open. He didn't pay attention to her, because he was aware of the troop preparations, the bugle calls and the voices of command that marred the dawn. Although after so many years of war they must have seemed familiar, this time he experienced the same sinking in the knees, and the same prickling of the skin that he had experienced in his youth in the presence of a naked woman. He thought dimly, caught at last in a trap of nostalgia, that perhaps if he had married her he would have been a man without war and without glory, a nameless craftsman, a happy animal. Already at the door, seeing that the rain continued, he let himself wear an old felt hat by José Arcadio Buendia. Orleano, Ursula then said to him, promise me that if you find yourself out there in a bad hour, you'll think of your mother. Without saying a word he left the house and faced the shouts, insults, and blasphemies that would follow him until he left the village. Ursula put the bar on the door, determined not to remove it for the rest of her life. We'll rot in here, he thought. We will turn to ashes in this house without men, but we will not give this miserable town the pleasure of seeing us cry. He was all morning looking for a memory of his son in the most secret corners, and he couldn't find it. The ceremony was held 20 kilometers from Macondo, in the shade of a gigantic ceiba tree around which the town of Neerlandia was later to be founded. Colonel Orleano Buendia arrived on a muddy mule. He was unshaven, more tormented by the pain of the swallows than by the immense failure of his dreams, since he had reached the end of all hope, beyond glory, and longing for glory. The act lasted just enough time for the signatures to be affixed. Without flinching, Colonel Orleano Buendia signed the first copy. He had not finished signing the last one when a rebel colonel appeared at the door of the tent, leading a mule loaded with 2 trunks by a halter. With exasperating parsimony he unloaded the trunks, opened them, and placed 72 gold bricks on the table one by one. Colonel Orleano Buendia had the 72 gold bricks included in the surrender inventory, and closed the act without allowing speeches. He then retired to a tent that had been prepared for him in case he wanted to rest. There he took off his shirt, sat on the edge of the cot, and at 3:15 in the afternoon he fired a pistol shot into the circle of iodine that his personal physician had painted on his chest. At that time, in Macondo, Ursula uncovered the pot of milk on the stove, surprised that it took so long to boil, and found it full of worms. They've killed Orleano, she exclaimed. She looked toward the patio, obeying a habit of his loneliness, and then she saw José Arcadio Buendia, drenched, sad from the rain and much older than he had been when he died. They have treacherously killed him, Ursula specified, and no one did him the charity of closing his eyes. She was still under her chestnut tree, sobbing on her husband's knee, when Colonel Orleano Buendia was brought in, wrapped in the blanket stiff with dried blood and with his eyes open with rage. He was out of danger. The projectile followed such a clean trajectory that the doctor inserted an iodine-soaked cord through his chest and out his back. This is my masterpiece, he told her with satisfaction. It was the only point where a bullet could pass without injuring any vital center. She then regretted not having shot herself in the palate as she had planned, only for circumventing Pilar Turner's forecast. If I still had authority, she told the doctor, she would have him shot without trial. Not for saving my life, but for making me look ridiculous. The failure of her death returned her lost prestige in a few hours. Later, when she rejected the Order of Merit awarded to her by the President of the Republic, even her fiercest rivals paraded her through her room asking her to disregard the terms of the armistice and promote a new war. At one point he seemed so enthusiastic about the idea of a new war that Colonel Gerinaldo Márquez thought he was just waiting for a pretext to proclaim it. The pretext was offered, in fact, when the President of the Republic refused to allocate war pensions to former combatants, liberals, or conservatives. Walking around the bedroom he dictated a strict message to the President of the Republic. In that telegram, which was never published, he denounced the first violation of the Neerlandia Treaty and threatened to declare war to the death if the allocation of pensions was not resolved within 15 days. But the only response from the government was the reinforcement of the military guard that had been posted at the door of the house, under the pretext of protecting it, and the prohibition of all kinds of visits. Similar measures were adopted throughout the country with other cautelos of care. It was such a timely, drastic, and effective operation that 2 months after the armistice, when Colonel Orleano Buendia was discharged, his most determined instigators were dead or expatriates, or had been assimilated forever into the public administration. Colonel Orleano Buendia left the room in December, and one glance at the corridor was enough for him not to think about the war again. With a vitality that seemed impossible at her age, Ursula had once again rejuvenated the house. Now they are going to see who I am, he said when he learned that his son would live. There will be no better house, nor more open to everyone, than this crazy house. The music of the player piano made the house happy again. Hearing her, Amaranta remembered Pietro Crespi, his twilight gardenia and his scent of lavender, and in the depths of her withered heart a clean resentment blossomed, purified by time. One afternoon when she was trying to put the living room in order, Ursula asked the soldiers guarding the house for help. She invited them to eat, gave them clothes and shoes, and taught them to read and write. When the government suspended surveillance, one of them remained living in the house, and was in his service for many years. On New Year's Day, driven mad by the rebuffs from Remedios the Beauty, the young commander of the guard woke up dying of love by his window. Years later, on his bed of agony, Orleano II would remember the rainy afternoon in June when he entered the bedroom to meet his first son. Though he was languid and weepy, without any trace of a Buendia, he didn't have to think twice about naming him. His name will be José Arcadio, he said. Fernanda del Carpio, the beautiful woman he had married the year before, agreed. On the other hand, Ursula could not hide a vague feeling of anxiety. While the Orleanos were withdrawn, but with a lucid mentality, the José Arcadios were impulsive and enterprising, but they were marked by a tragic sign. The only cases of impossible classification were those of José Arcadio II and Orleano II. They were so similar and mischievous during their childhood that not even Santa Sofía de la Piedad could tell them apart. On the day of the baptism, Amaranta gave them slaves with their respective names and dressed them in clothes of different colors marked with the initials of each one, but when they began to attend school they chose to change their clothes and slaves and to call themselves with crossed names. Since then no one knew for sure who was who. Time finished messing things up. The one who kept the name of Orleano II in the games of confusion became monumental like his grandfather, and the one who kept the name of José Arcadio II became bony like the colonel, and the only thing they kept in common was the lonely heir of the family. The decisive difference was revealed in the middle of the war when José Arcadio II asked Colonel Gerineldo Márquez to take him to see the executions. Orleano II, on the other hand, shuddered at the mere idea of witnessing an execution. He preferred the house. When he was 12 years old, he asked Ursula what was in the closed room. Papers, she replied. They are Melchiad's books and the strange things he wrote in his last years. Ursula gave him the keys. On the shelves were the books bound in a pale cardboard material like tanned human skin, and the manuscripts were intact. The boy enjoyed the story of a woman who sat at the table and ate only grains of rice that she pinned, and the story of the fisherman who borrowed from his neighbor a sinker for his net and the fish with which he caught it. Rewarded later had a diamond in his stomach, and with the wish-fulfilling lamp and the flying rugs. Amazed, he asked Ursula if all that was true, and she answered yes, that many years before the gypsies had brought the marvelous lamps and flying mats to Macondo. What's happening to her, she sighed, is that the world is ending little by little and those things no longer come. Orleano II undertook the task of deciphering the manuscripts. It was impossible. The lyrics resembled clothes hanging on a wire to dry, and were more like musical writing than literary writing. One fiery noon, as he perused the manuscripts, he felt that he was not alone in the room. Against the reverberation of the window, seated with his hands on his knees, was Melchiad's. He was no more than 40 years old. Orleano II recognized him immediately, because that hereditary memory had been passed down from generation to generation, and had come to him from the memory of his grandfather. Cheers, said Orleano II. Cheers, young man, Melchiad said. Since then, for several years, they saw each other almost every afternoon. Melchiad talked to him about the world, tried to instill in him his old wisdom, but he refused to translate the manuscripts. No one should know the meaning of it until they are 100 years old, he explained. Orleano II kept the secret of those interviews forever. José Arcadio II, meanwhile, had satisfied the illusion of seeing an execution. For the rest of his life he would remember the livid flash of 6 simultaneous shots, and that he was still smiling even when they untied him from the post and put him in a crate full of lime. He is alive, he thought. They're going to bury him alive. He was so impressed that ever since he hated military practices and war, not because of the executions but because of the appalling custom of burying those who were shot alive. Nobody knew then at what moment he began to ring the bells in the tower, and to help Father Antonio Isabel, successor of El Cachorro, attend mass and to take care of fighting cocks in the courtyard of the parish house. When Colonel Gerineldo Márquez found out, he harshly reprimanded him for learning trades repudiated by the liberals. The point, he replied, is that it seems to me that I have come out conservative. He told Ursula. Better, she approved. I hope he gets involved as a priest, so that God finally enters this house. Very soon it was learned that Father Antonio Isabel was preparing him for his first communion. He taught her catechism while he shaved the roosters' necks. Since then, the parish priest manifested the first symptoms of senile delirium that led him to say, years later, that the devil had probably won the rebellion against God, and that it was he who was sitting on the heavenly throne, without revealing his true identity to catch the unsuspecting. Fired by the intrepidity of his tutor, José Arcadio II became in a few months as skilled in theological martingales to confuse the devil as he was skilled in cockpit tricks. 2 nights before his first communion, Father Antonio Isabel locked himself in the sacristy with him to confess him, with the help of a dictionary of sins. It was such a long list that the old priest, accustomed to going to bed at 6, fell asleep in his chair before finishing. He was not surprised when the father asked him if he had done bad things with women, and he honestly answered no, but he was taken aback by the question if he had done them with animals. Later he put the question to Petronio, the sick sacristan who lived in the tower and who, they said, fed on bats, and Petronio replied, there are corrupt Christians who do their things with donkeys. José Arcadio II continued to show so much curiosity, he asked for so many explanations, that Petronio lost patience. I go on Tuesday nights, he confessed. If you promise not to tell anyone, I'll take you the other Tuesday. The following Tuesday, he took José Arcadio II to a nearby orchard. He became a man of roosters. Take those animals somewhere else, Ursula ordered him the first time she saw him come in with his fine fighting animals. José Arcadio II took them without question, but he continued to raise them with Pilar Ternera, his grandmother, who made everything she needed available to her, in exchange for having him in the house. He soon demonstrated in the cockpit the wisdom instilled in him by Father Antonio Isabel, and he had enough money not only to enrich his offspring, but also to procure the satisfaction of a man. Ursula compared him at that time with his brother and could not understand how the two twins who had seemed like a single person in childhood had ended up being so different. His perplexity did not last long, because very soon Orleano II began to show signs of laziness and dissipation. While he was locked up in Melquiad's room he was a self-absorbed man, as was Colonel Orleano Buendia in his youth. But shortly before the Treaty of Neerlandia, an accident took him out of his reverie and confronted him with the reality of the world. A young woman, who was selling numbers for an accordion raffle, greeted him very familiarly. Orleano II was not surprised because it often happened that he was confused with his brother. But he didn't clear up the mistake, and he ended up taking her to his room. He grew so fond of him from that first meeting that he cheated in the raffle so that he would win the accordion. After 2 weeks, Orleano II realized that the woman had been sleeping alternately with him and with her brother, believing they were the same man, and instead of clearing up the situation, he managed to prolong it. He did not return to Melquiad's room. He spent the afternoons in the patio, learning to play the accordion by ear, against Ursula's protests. However, Orleano II became a virtuoso on the accordion and remained so after he married and had children and was one of the most respected men in Macondo. For almost 2 months he shared the woman with his brother. 2 days later he found his brother clinging to a bathroom beam, drenched in sweat and crying her eyes out, and then he understood. His brother confessed that the woman had disowned him for bringing him what she called a disease of the bad life. He also told her how Pilar Ternera tried to cure him. Orleano II secretly submitted to the burning permanganate washes and the diuretic waters, and both were cured separately after 3 months of secret suffering. José Arcadio II did not see the woman again. Orleano II obtained her forgiveness and stayed with her until her death. She was called Petra Coates. She had arrived in Macondo in the middle of the war, with an occasional husband who lived off raffles, and when the man died, she continued with the business. When Ursula realized that José Arcadio II was a galero and Orleano II played the accordion at his concubine's noisy parties, he thought he was going crazy with confusion. It was as if the family's flaws and none of its virtues had been concentrated in both of them. So she decided that no one would ever be called Orleano and José Arcadio again. However, when Orleano II had his first child, he did not dare to cross him. Okay, said Ursula, but on one condition, I'll take care of raising him. Although she was already 100 years old and on the verge of going blind from cataracts, she kept her physical dynamism, integrity of character, and mental balance intact. No one better than her to train the virtuous man who would restore the prestige of the family, a man who had never heard of war, fighting cocks, women of bad life and delusional companies, 4 calamities that, according to Ursula thought, they had determined the decline of her lineage. This will be a priest, she solemnly promised her. And if God gives me life, he has to become pope. In a few years, without effort, by sheer luck, he had accumulated one of the greatest fortunes in the swamp, thanks to the supernatural proliferation of his animals. Her mares gave birth to triplets, the hens laid twice a day, and the pigs fattened up with such abandon. Save money now, Ursula would say to her harebrained great-grandson. This luck will not last you a lifetime. But Orleano II paid no attention to him. The more he uncorked champagne to soak his friends, the more wildly his animals gave birth, and the more he became convinced that his lucky star was not his behavior but the influence of Petra Coates, his concubine, whose love had the virtue of exasperating the mother nature. He never kept Petra Coates away from her children, and even when he married and had children he continued to live with her with Fernanda's consent. Orleano II barely had time to watch his cattle. It was enough for him to take Petra Coates to her breeding grounds, and ride her on horseback through her land, so that any animal marked with her brand would succumb to the irremediable pestilence of proliferation. Like all the good things that happened to them in his long life, that wild fortune had its origin in chance. Until the end of the wars, Petra Coates continued to support herself with the proceeds of her raffles, and Orleano Segundo managed to loot Ursula's piggy banks from time to time. They were a frivolous couple, with no more worries than going to bed every night. "That woman has been your downfall," Ursula would yell at her great-grandson when he saw him enter the house like a sleepwalker. "She has you so dumbfounded, that one of these days I will see you writhing with colic, with a toad stuck in your belly." Orleano Segundo only thought then of finding a job that would allow him to maintain a house for Petra Coates, and die with her,